Hey, welcome to a new Tuts Plus course. I'm Adi, and in this course, you'll learn how to create Figma plugins. Now, I'm sure you know about Figma, right? It's one of the most popular UI/UX design tools out there, and one of its greatest selling points is represented by plugins. These allow users to extend the native functionality of the app by creating behaviors and features that weren't there by default. Now, because Figma has a huge community behind it, there are tons of plugins available to download. However, sometimes you might not find what you're looking for despite the large offering, and in this case, the only choice is to create your own. So, in this course, I'm going to show you step by step how to create your very own Figma plugin. We'll actually create two plugins, a basic one and then a more complex one that has a UI, a user interface. It's the one that you're seeing right now. This second plugin will allow us to create a list of tints for a given color and place those in a frame with auto layout. In terms of course structure, we'll begin by learning what Figma plugins can and cannot do, and then we'll follow up with a basic example. In the final two lessons, we'll get to the more tricky bits and bobs, and we'll learn how to set up a work environment for writing and testing plugins, and then we'll create the color tint generator you saw earlier. Now, before we begin, let me just say that I would rate this course as intermediate in terms of difficulty. You need to know the basics of web development for this. A bit of HTML, a bit of CSS, definitely JavaScript, because Figma plugins are written in JavaScript. At the very minimum, you should understand how to work with variables, functions, arrays, objects, and loops. If you don't know these, you probably won't be able to understand everything we're going to do in this course. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get to work. But first, a quick message from Envato Elements. With one subscription, you'll have unlimited access to over 4,000 website templates for Figma, UI kits, icons, stock photos, and more. There are millions of digital assets to choose from. They have simple commercial licensing, and you can cancel anytime. Subscribe now using the link in the video description. All right, so let's get this show on the road. Next up, we'll talk about what Figma plugins can and cannot do. That's coming up in the next lesson. I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, we're going to talk about what Figma plugins can do and what they cannot do. And I think this is really important to know before you write a single line of code, because you might think that you can do certain things with plugins, and when that plugin inevitably doesn't do what you want it to do, you won't know if you have faulty code, if the code that you wrote is faulty, or if what you're trying to do is simply not possible. Does that make sense? So let's start with what Figma plugins can do. All right, number one, Figma plugins can access the Figma document and all of its contents. It can perform read and write operations on pages, frames, groups, and layers. Number two, Figma plugins can edit layer properties like font, scale, color, fill, position, constraints, and alignment. Finally, number three, Figma plugins can work with components. They can clone or remove components and also create instances for these. Pretty simple, right? You can do a lot with Figma plugins, and that's one of the reasons they are so powerful. Now, let's take a look at the things that Figma plugins cannot do. Number one, you cannot run multiple Figma plugins at the same time, nor can you run a plugin in the background. So if you open a plugin, you need to close it before running another one. Number 2, Figma plugins cannot be triggered on events taking place in your Figma document. Number 3, Figma plugins cannot be triggered by keyboard shortcuts. Yet, maybe we'll get that functionality in the future, but for now, you have to trigger them manually. Number 4, Figma plugins cannot access a theme library or the version history of your document. And finally, number 5, you cannot dock a Figma plugin's user interface in the Properties panel. The plugin window is always floating and you can move it wherever you like. All right, and that's about it for this very short lesson. Now that you know what you can and cannot do with Figma plugins, I think it's time we create a very basic one. That's coming up in the next lesson, so I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, we'll create our first Figma plugin. It's going to be a very simple one, but that's on purpose because it will allow us to learn the basics of plugin development. Let's go. All right, when creating Figma plugins, you will need two things. First of all, you'll need the Figma documentation for developers. You can find it at figma.com/developers, and you just click this little button here. It's going to take you to the plugin docs/intro. This contains pretty much anything you want to know about creating plugins for Figma. It's the best resource that you're going to have. And whenever you're stuck at some point, this is the place to visit for more information. You have a search functionality. All the information is nicely organized in various pages here, and this is going to be your best friend. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the Figma desktop app. So you won't be able to create and test plugins in the browser version. You need to download the desktop app for Figma. That's super simple. It's available on both Mac and Windows, and it's free to download. You just go to figma.com and you'll have a link to download the app. And actually, it's not two things you need, it's three things you need. The third is a code editor. Personally, I'm using Visual Studio Code, and this is actually the editor that's recommended by Figma for developing plugins. Because as you'll see in the next lesson, VS Code has some features that will help you tremendously when creating more complex plugins for Figma. So those are the three things: the documentation, the desktop app for Figma, and a code editor, preferably Visual Studio Code. Okay, what I did was I created a folder on my desktop called Demo Figma Plugins, and I opened that folder in my code editor. The next step is to go to the Figma app, go to the menu, Plugins, Development, New Plugin. Here you specify a plugin name, let's say first plugin. You can call this whatever you want. Next, you will decide whether you want to create for Figma and FigJam or just for Figma Design, as they call it here. We're going to select Figma Design. Hit Next. Now this gives you three options: empty, run once, and with UI and browser APIs. You don't necessarily need any of this, but it makes it easier. For the purposes of this first plugin, we're going to select empty and then save as. We'll go to our desktop, we'll select our folder called Demo Figma Plugins, and we'll hit save. And now Figma tells us that, hey, we created a new plugin for you, and we'll just say done. Now, if we look back in VS Code, we have a new folder created called First Plugin, and inside that folder, we have two files, a manifest.json and a code.js. The manifest JSON contains all the information about our plugin. We have the name of the plugin that we can edit here at all times, an ID, a version of the API, and which file, which JavaScript file to use for the plugin code. In our case, we're using code.js. Now, whenever you want to import a plugin, this is the file that will be required, right? Manifest JSON. Whatever we write in code.js will be code that's executed by the plugin. So then, let's talk about the plugin that we're going to write. It's going to be a very simple one that will allow us to select elements with the same name as the one that's currently selected. So, for example, let's say we have a couple of boxes here, right? Let's make like 5 boxes in total, something like that. And let's call these all rectangle. Well, let's just say 3 of them are called rectangle. And let's give these some separate colors. Something like that. So we want our plugin to read our currently selected element, let's say this one, and then find all the other elements that have the same name and select them. Okay? Pretty simple task. So then, let's go back to our code, and we're going to say the following. We're going to create a function called a run plugin, and then we're going to call that function. Now, inside the function, we'll start with the following. We'll get the number of selected elements. How do we do that? Well, we create a variable called selected elements, and then we can access the Figma object, and then we can select the current page. So the page that I'm currently on in Figma, in our case, is page 1. And then I can call something named selection. Now, selection is going to give me an array of all the selected elements. Let me show you. I'm going to do a console log selected elements, and I'm going to save this file. Now, Figma actually has a console we can use. So you need to go to the menu, Plugins, Development, Open Console. Alternatively, you can use the shortcut Option Command I, or I believe on Windows is Alt Control I, but don't quote me on that. And this is going to open up a nice console. Let's clear this code. Now, to run our Figma plugin, we can do the following. We can open up the command from Figma with command and slash, and we can search for first plugin. See, this is currently in development. Or we can go to plugins, development, first plugin. And when we click it, we're essentially running first plugin. Now, this just keeps on running because we actually need to close it. This is very important. Always remember to close the plugin after you run it. So let's do that again. I'm going to use the command option here because it's much simpler. And by doing that, in the console, we can see that the plugin has started. It executed that console log we wrote earlier, and then the plugin has closed. And currently the selection array is empty, right? It has a length of 0. But if I select one element and I run the plugin again, well, this time in that selection array, we have one element, right? We have this rectangle node. And if we go even deeper, we can find the properties of that node, like the fill, height, name, etc., etc. So then, what we want to get here is the number of selected elements. So we're going to say selection length. Next, we're going to empty this console log, and we're going to say the following: display error messages on invalid selections. So I want to run the plugin only when one element is selected. Okay, so if I don't have anything selected, I'm going to display a message saying, hey, no element selected. Or if I have more than one element selected, I'm going to, again, close the plugin and give a message of, hey, please select a single element. That's really easy to do. I can say if selected elements is 0, then I can say Figma close plugin, and I can pass in a parameter here, no element selected. And then just for the sake of this code, I'm going to hit return to make sure the function ends properly. So now let's clear this console and let's run the plugin. By the way, you can use another shortcut in Figma, Option Command P, and that's going to run the last plugin, right? So again, we're running the plugin. It says, hey, no elements selected. Now, what if I select multiple elements like so? Well, I can say if selected elements is actually higher than 1, I can do the same thing, Figma close plugin, and I'm going to say, please select a single element, and then return again. So now I have multiple elements selected. I run the plugin again, and Figma tells me, hey, please select a single element. Okay, so now when I select a single element and I run the plugin, nothing happens because we haven't specified anything. So let's do that right now. First, I need to find the name of the selected element. So I'm going to create a variable called selected name, and that's going to be equal to Figma current page, selection, and remember, selection gives me an array, which means I can get its first element like that. And I can say dot name. Dot name, if you remember from the console log, is one of the properties of that object. So now, just to test things out, if we do a console log of selected name, and we run the plugin, that's going to say, hey, look, you selected rectangle. What if I select this one? Rectangle 2, right? I run the plugin. It tells me the name is rectangle 2. Cool. Next, this is where it gets interesting. We're going to get all the elements with the same name as the selected one. How do we do that? Well, we create a variable called with same name. And here I'm going to say the following: Figma current page, and we're going to use a method called find all. Now, find all is a method that applies to this Figma object, and its purpose is to find all the elements that fit certain criteria. Now, our criteria is to have the same name as the selected node or the selected element. For that, we need to write a callback function. We're going to call this has same name. Now let's go ahead and write that function right here. We'll say callback function for find all. So it's a pretty simple function, has same name. We're passing in a node as a parameter, and we're going to return node.name equals selected name. So basically, Figma will go through all the elements in the page or all the nodes in the page. And if the name of that node matches what we got from our selection, then it returns true. And then it puts those results in this variable here called with same name. So then, once we have all of the elements, we can select all elements with the same name as the selected one. We do that by saying Figma current page selection equals with same name. So we're basically saying, look, I want the selection to be whatever we got from running this function. So let's see if that works. Let's select this rectangle. Notice its name is rectangle, and we have two others that share the same name. So basically, these three right here are all called rectangle. This is called rectangle 1, this rectangle 2. So if I select rectangle 2 and I run the plugin, only rectangle 2 will be selected. Same goes for rectangle 1, right? But if I select this and I run the plugin, well then Figma selects all three elements. And I can go ahead and select this one and run the plugin. It's going to be the exact same result. As a final touch, when we're closing the plugin, we can display a message, right? And we can say with same name dot length, because this is an array, plus elements selected. And then let's just return out of this function to make sure it closes properly. So now select this, run the plugin, and Figma tells me, hey, 3 elements selected. If I run this, I have 1 element selected. Let's do something else. Let's call this rectangle 2, and let's also call this rectangle 2. Now, if I run the plugin, it's going to select these 2 elements, and it's going to say 2 elements selected. Cool. So that's our first plugin, right? Just as a quick recap, the manifest.json contains information about our plugin, like the name, ID, version of the API, and the JavaScript file that's going to use. And then the code.js contains the JavaScript code to run that plugin. For this simple plugin, we're basically getting the element that's selected in our page, and we're getting its name. And then we're searching the page for elements that have the same name by using this code right here. Then we're selecting those elements by using figma.currentPage.selection. And we're passing in the array that was generated right here. And then we're closing the plugin. And that's it. Very simple. This was a basic plugin with no user interface, as you saw. So it didn't open anything. It just ran the code and performed certain actions on the Figma elements. And you can do that. That's totally fine. You don't always need a user interface for Figma plugins. All right, and that's our first plugin. As I said, very simple, but one that shows us how plugins work at the most basic level. Now, let's turn things up a notch and actually create a more complex plugin, one that has a UI, a user interface. But before we get there, we actually have to set up a more appropriate working environment. We'll do that in the next lesson, so I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this lesson, we'll start exploring some more complex plugins, and we'll also set up a more suitable working environment for creating and testing such plugins. We'll also take a closer look at a demo plugin that has a user interface. So let's begin. Okay, the first step for this is to install Node.js on your system. That's why in the intro video I said that, hey, you need to know the basics of web development for this. And Node.js is really at the center of this entire setup. So I'm going to assume that you have Node installed. Next, we need to install TypeScript. For that, I can simply open up a terminal in VS Code, and I can say sudo npm install globally TypeScript. Okay, TypeScript is now installed. Then we need to go to Figma and create a new plugin. So again, go to the Figma menu, plugins, development, new plugin. Let's call this second plugin. Select Figma design. Next, this time we're going to select this third option that says with UI and browser APIs. So we're going to save as second plugin inside the demo Figma plugins folder. Save that and done. Now, if we open up Visual Studio Code again, we can see that in the second plugin folder, we have a lot more content, right? Previously, we just had manifest.json and code.js. This time, we have the code.js, obviously, but we're also having the code.ts. This is TypeScript. This is what we'll be using to write the JavaScript code. Then we also have a package.json, some README, a tsconfig for TypeScript, and also a UI.html. We'll take a look at these in just a little bit, but for now, there are a few more steps that we need to make. First, we need to install the typings. That's going to allow our TypeScript code to directly access and show us all the methods and all the properties of the Figma object and more. We can do that easily with the following command. npm install, we're going to save as a dependency here, Figma/plugin typings. Okay, that created this node modules folder. But I actually made a mistake. We need to cd into the second plugin directory here and run the same command, because the node modules needs to be saved inside here. So let's delete that extra folder there. Next, we need to set up the TypeScript compiler. For that, you need to hit Command-Shift-B or Control-Shift-B for Windows. That's going to show us 3 tasks here. We're going to select tsc watch second plugin /tsconfig.json. All right, so this opens up a watch task that will basically watch our code.ts file for any changes, and it's going to convert that code.ts file into the code.js. So it converts TypeScript code into JavaScript code. Pretty cool, right? So now let's see what this demo plugin is doing. I'm going to jump back to Figma, and I'm going to select second plugin. This is a plugin with a user interface, right? And it's basically a rectangle creator. You specify how many rectangles you want, you hit create, and Figma automatically creates those rectangles for you and selects them. That's pretty cool, right? Let's take a look at the code. So first of all, when the plugin is running, it shows the UI and it defaults to this HTML, which is UI.html. Now this is just standard markup. We have an H2, a paragraph, and 2 buttons. On top of that, the plugin also defines a script. And inside, we have JavaScript code. So when the create button is clicked, we get the text box and its value in these 2 constants. And then, and this is the most important part, we're sending a message from the UI to the JavaScript code by using parent.postMessage. And inside, we're setting the plugin message. We can specify a certain type, and this is totally up to us. And then the message contents. In our case, we're sending the count. And then this asterisk is for authentication. You don't really need to worry about this right now. And then when we click cancel, we're also sending a message to the JavaScript code that's saying the plugin message is basically cancel. So then back in the code.js or TS, it doesn't really matter. It's exactly the same thing, but TypeScript just offers a few extra things on top of JavaScript. Here, we're receiving that message, or we're reading that message by using Figma.ui.onMessage, right? So we're getting the message in this object right here, and then we're checking for the message type. Is it to create rectangles? Then we're generating those rectangles by using this code. And then we're setting those rectangles as the current selection in Figma, and we are scrolling and zooming into view on that particular selection. And then if the message type is anything other than create rectangles, we are closing the plugins. So it's not really complicated. You know, the way the UI communicates with the code, with the plugin code, the UI just basically sends a message by using the post message function. And then when we're writing the JavaScript code, we're checking for that message by using Figma.ui.onMessage. And then depending on the message type, we decide what we want to do. And the result of all of this code is that when we're running the plugin, right, it displays this UI. It asks us how many rectangles we want to create. And when we hit create, the JavaScript code is ran and we get the final result here. Now, why did we go through all the trouble of setting up the typings and all of that stuff? Well, because I can now go into my TypeScript code and I can say Figma dot, and VS Code will show me all the methods and all the properties that are available for that Figma object. And not just for the Figma object, I can say current page dot, and it's exactly the same thing. It just makes it easier for us to develop Figma plugins by essentially giving us an autocomplete here, which is just fantastic. All right, so now that our working space is all set up for creating plugins and we understand how the more complex plugins work, the ones that have a user interface, how about we create our own? We'll do that in the next lesson, so I'll see you there. Welcome back to the course. In this final lesson, we'll build a more complex plugin that will generate a set number of tints based on a color of our choosing. Then it's going to display those tints in a frame that will also generate. This is a bit more complex and it's going to take quite a bit of JavaScript to accomplish, but I'll try and explain every step that we're going to take, so it should be easy peasy. Let's begin. Before we get started writing code, let me show you the finished plugin so you can know what we're building. I have that as a color tint generator, and it's basically going to have a very simple UI like so. So we can basically select the color here, give it a name, select how many tints we want. I maxed it out at 10. Select the circle size, circle spacing, frame orientation, and then we can generate those tints. Now, a tint, if you don't know, is basically a version of a color mixed with white. For this example, I have a white background, and I'm just gradually lowering the opacity on each and one of these layers. I go from 100% to 10% opacity, just like you can see here. And this, if you go ahead and sample that color, it's going to show you a tint of the original color that we have here. So this is what we're going to create. Now, we'll be using the second plugin that we created in the previous lesson as a base for our new plugin. All we have to do really is go in here, just delete all this code, go in here, delete all this code, because we'll be writing our own. So now if we go to Figma, we run that second plugin, it says, hey, unable to load because we don't have any code. So let's begin by writing a small description telling us what the plugin will do, and then showing the plugin UI. So for that, we'll say Figma show UI, and then inside we'll add HTML. And then let's not forget to close that plugin. Now, for the UI, I'm going to go ahead and paste in the HTML code and then just quickly walk you through it. The HTML looks something like this. We have an H1 that has the title of our plugin, and then we have a form, and I also gave it an ID. And then I'm using field sets and legend to separate the various sections of the form. So we have an input type color for the color, and I also set it as at a default value. We have an input type text for the color name, a number for the number of tints. By default, this is set to 10, but I set it at a min of 1 and max of 10. And then we have some frame information, right, for the actual frame that we're going to generate inside Figma. The circle size, right, so how big should the circle be, the spacing between the circles, and also the frame orientation. For this, I used an input type radio, so radio buttons. And I also have an input type hidden. For now, don't worry about this. I'll show you why this is useful in just a little bit. And then two buttons, one for generating tints and one for cancel. So now we have the HTML here. If we open up the plugin, right, that briefly displays the UI, and it just closes the plugin. Let me just comment this so you can see what we're dealing with. Now, as you can see, the UI is pretty tall here. We have to scroll. What you're seeing here is the default size of a plugin window, but we can actually change that. Right here, when we say show UI, we can actually pass an object with some properties like width. Let's make it 320 pixels. Height, I'm going to make it 640. And we can also give it a title. I'm going to say color tint generator. So by doing that, let's close the plugin. And now we have a much larger plugin, right? With a proper title, the width that we wanted, and also the height that we wanted. Next, let's write the code for these two buttons. For that, we'll go back to UI HTML. We'll say script. And then inside, we'll do the following. Document, get element by ID. So first we need to get the action for this generate button. So we'll say generate, right? So on click, we're going to have a nice function here. And then we're going to do the exact same thing for the cancel button. Now for the cancel, we're going to say parent post message. Remember this method from the previous lesson. We're sending a message to code TS. So here we're going to say plugin message type. Let's set this to action exit. And then we'll set that asterisk as authentication. Let's copy this. And this time, when we click generate, the action or the plugin message type, let's set this to action generate. Okay, now back in code TS, we need to listen for that message, right? So we're going to say the following. Message received, and we'll say Figma UI on message, and we'll do the following. If message type, if message type equals action generate, which means if we clicked the generate button, then we'll do like the main action of the plugin, which should end with closing the plugin, right? So we'll say Figma close plugin, and we'll also show a message saying tints generated successfully. So that happens if the message type is action generate. Else, if the message type equals action exit, then we can just say Figma close plugin and we're done. So let's test this. Second plugin, we hit generate and it says tints generated successfully. Or if we hit cancel, it's just going to close the plugin. Just like that. Cool. Now, what we need to do is we need to get the form information from the UI, compile it somehow in a format that we can send over to the TS, and then grab that inside the TS code and act upon it. So then, from the UI, we'll do the following. First, we need to get the form, right? So I'm going to create a new variable called plugin form, and I'm going to say document query selector, and we're going to select the plugin form that we generated right here. Next, we're going to get all the field data from the form using the form data constructor. So another variable called plugin form data equals to new form data, and we'll pass in our form. Now, this form data that we got is not quite the right format to send to our TypeScript code. We have to transform it in another format. For that, we'll be placing it in an object. So let's do the following. We'll create an object and populate it with the form data. So we're going to say let form data object. You can call this whatever you want. Basically, we'll initialize it as an empty object. And then we're going to use a for loop. Let the form data is basically a collection of key value pairs. So we're going to say key value of plugin form data object of key will be equal to value. All right, so then we can do a console log of the form data object to see what it looks like. So let's go. Let's see, generate tints, and there you have it. We now have an object, color code, the color name, the tint number, size, spacing, and so on. And you'll see that if I change these values, of course, they will be different in the object as well, secondary. Let's say 5 tints here, generate, and as you can see, they are reflected in here as well. And if we look at the other key value pairs, let's see, we don't see any. So what's going on there? And the value was evaluated upon, may have changed. That object is probably destroyed by the time we see it here. Yeah, okay. So this is just a quick fix to be able to see this console log. Don't worry about it. So basically this object now contains all the information from our form, right? every single one of these form fields has a corresponding key value pair in our object. The only problem is the direction, right? Because if we select vertical here, for example, and we generate that again, you'll see that the direction says on and frame direction is horizontal. That's because on our HTML, on our form, I have an input type hidden that's called frame direction. It's this one right here. And by default, it's set to horizontal. The direction is always set to on because getting form data using this constructor sometimes, or most of the times, doesn't work properly with checked elements like checkboxes, radio buttons, and so on. Therefore, I created an additional input called frame direction that we can use to determine the frame orientation, either horizontal or vertical. For that, we need to write just a bit more JavaScript here. And that JavaScript should be placed right here after we're getting the form data. And let's just write a small explanation here. And then we're going to say if document query selector frame vertical is checked, then we'll say plugin form data dot set, so we can actually alter it after we get it from using this this constructor. We're going to target frame direction, and we're going to set it to vertical. All right, super simple. So basically, we're making a check here. We're taking the value of frame V, which is this radio button here, and if this is checked, then we're setting the value of this hidden input to vertical instead of horizontal. Okay, so now this should actually be reflected. If I select vertical here, generate, and I look at the frame direction, it's now vertical. So now all the information from my UI, from my form, is placed correctly in this object. Now, all we have to do is remove this console log, and we can actually send the form data object from my UI to my TypeScript code using parent post message, and where the type is action generate, I also attach this form data object. Okay, so now if I go back to code TS, after I receive the message, I can do a console log of message dot form data object. So let's see if we are receiving that message, and we are. Cool. Now let's act on this content. We'll be creating elements in Figma by using the information that was passed in that object. For that, to make our job a lot easier, let's go ahead and create some variables that contain all the data from that object. So instead of going message form data object and then select the, I don't know, circle size or whatever, I can just say circle size as a variable created by us. It's just going to make things much easier. For that, we can use something called destructuring in JavaScript. And I'm going to say destructure the form data object. This goes something like this. We'll create a constant of circle size, circle spacing, color code, color name, frame direction, and tint number. And this is the exact order that they're placed in my object, right? In the one that we're sending to my code. So this will be equal to MSG form data object. right? So this is destructuring. Now I basically have access to all of these variables directly without having to go through msg.dataObject. Cool. So now let's start by creating the frame that will house our tints and give it a name. We're going to say constant parent frame, because we'll be working with this later on, Figma dot create frame. See how useful this autocomplete is that we set up earlier? It just makes it so much easier to write code. So let's give this a name. We're going to say parent frame dot name. That's going to be equal to tints for the, and let's add the color name to this plus color. All right, let's try it out. So the color name is called primary. Let's change this to whatever, generate tints, and that creates a new frame that's called tints for the whatever color. Pretty cool, huh? Next up, let's add auto layout to the frame and set the direction, padding, and spacing, and also maybe the sizing mode. For that, we say parent frame dot layout mode. This basically sets whether we use auto layout or not. By default, it's none. And if we use auto layout, it sets the direction. It's either horizontal or vertical. So layout mode is going to be equal to frame direction. It needs to be uppercase. So we're going to say to uppercase. Next, let's delete this. Let's see if it's working. And it is. It's now set to auto layout horizontal. Perfect. Let's add some padding. So we'll say parent frame dot padding. By the way, vertical padding, horizontal padding, you can use these as well, but they're actually deprecated. So instead, use the individual values, left, right, top, and bottom. We'll set that to 64 because we're not getting this value from anywhere. So this will be right, top, bottom. All right, let's check it out. And now this has 64 padding around items. Great. Now let's set up the item spacing. For that, we'll say parent frame item spacing equals circle spacing. Right, so the item spacing will be set right here. Let's see if that works. Generate, oops. Expected item spacing to have type number, but instead got string. Okay, so we can simply do a parse int here and send that as a number instead of a string. Cool. So now we have the correct item spacing that we set up in our UI, correct? Now if I set this to maybe, I don't know, 98, generate, I have a new frame with 98 spacing. Let's move on. Here I'm going to add two more things. Parent frame dot primary axis sizing mode. I'm going to set that to auto. And also counter axis sizing mode. I'm going to set that to auto. This will basically set these two values here to hug contents. That's exactly what I want. I want the frame to resize automatically based on its contents. Okay, now what else? We need to generate the tints as those circles, right? So we say generate the tints as ellipses. We do a for loop. We initialize I with a value of 0. We go until I is smaller than tint number, and we do I++, and let me just make this a tad smaller. And then we say constant tint node, this is what we call it, you can call it whatever you want, equals figma.create ellipse. Now with this ellipse, we can give it a name. So we say tint node dot name equals to color name plus, let's do a small space here, plus we'll do the following: 100 minus I times 10. Because I want these to be named the color, for example, primary, dash 100, dash 90, dash 80, and so on. So the layer name should reflect the name of the color, dash the opacity. And because we're in a for loop, we take advantage of this, this index here, this I value. So for example, if we're on the first color, the I is going to be 0. So 100 minus 0 is going to be 100. On the color dash 90, or on the second element, the I is going to be 1. So I'm going to have 100 minus I times 1, minus, 1 times 10, that's 10. 100 minus 10 is 90. So it's going to be color dash 90, and so on and so forth. Next, let's size the layer. So I'm going to say tint node dot. You might be inclined to say width and set that to a particular value, or height, but it doesn't work. Width and height are read-only properties. To give a node a proper size, you need to use the resize method. So resize, you're going to say parse int circle size, and then again parse int circle size, because it takes width and height, and because it's a circle, both the width and height are the same. All right, so now let's test things out here. Let's see if it's working properly. Let's say I have 6 tints, right? So right now it generates my 6 tints. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They are named correctly, so primary 100, 90, 80, 70, and so on. But of course, they're not added to the frame just yet. But they do have the correct size, 120 by 120. Now, let's work on giving these the proper color. This is where it gets trickier. So color the layer, and we're going to say the following. Tint node dot. To change the color, you got to do it the following way. Fills equals, and you're going to pass in an array with an object like so. You got to set up the type. In my case, it's solid. And you got to set up the color. And the color is another object. And it goes like this. R for red. And you put in a value from 0 to 1. Let's say 0. And then G, that's for green, from RGB. Let's also put this to 0. And then B, let's also put this to 0. So now you'll see that this generates black layers, because RGB 000 is just pure black. Now, to set up the proper color, we need to create a function that will transform a hex value into an RGB value, because if you remember, the object that's received here presents the color in a hex format. So here's what we do. We'll write the following function. Convert the hex value to RGB. And we have a function called hex to RGB. It receives a hex parameter, and then it does all of this crazy stuff. Now, I don't really know what's going on here. I actually got this function after searching for Stack Overflow, and you can find the link right here. So many thanks to the person who replied to this older thread. Basically, we're applying regular expressions to the hex code that we're getting, and we're separating those results into R, G, and B values. And this, of course, I tested. It works beautifully. It basically takes a hex value and it transforms it into a RGB value for that particular color. So now what we have to do here is create 3 variables for the R, G, and B values. It's going to make it much easier for us. So I'm going to say color, or actually let's do constant, color R equals hex to RGB, and I'm going to pass in the color code. And let's do the same for the color G and then the color B, like so. And here I can say .r because it's returning an object, right? .g and .b. So I'm basically getting the R, G, and B's returned from this function into these 3 constants. And then I can set those right here. So color R, color G, and color B. So if you're going to run this code, you're going to see that, hey, what's up? Error. Fills of 0 color R expects to be to have a value smaller or equal than 1. That's because, as I was saying previously, when you're setting a color like this, this color object expects values between 0 and 1. And currently, the values that we have are all over the place, right? They're definitely higher than 1. And just to show you that, let's actually comment this. And I'm going to do a console log of color R, color G, and color B. And you'll see what I'm talking about. So if I generate this, notice that the color that we chose has 246, 84, and 70. Right? So if we generate that, we can see that in the log, we have 246, 87, 84, and 70, the exact same values. But these, each individual one is not between 0 and 1. To represent these 3 values at a scale between 0 and 1, all we have to do is divide each one by 255. Right? And actually, let me keep that that console log so you can see the new values. Okay. Save, and let's run this again. Okay, so now those values are 0.964 whatever, 0.3, 0.2, and so on and so forth. So these are the values that we can now apply right here to our element. Okay, let's run this plugin again. Let's pick a nice color here, and let's generate those tints. So this color has this hex code, right? 5B94D2. Generate, and there it is, 5B94D2. Cool. So now we're getting the correct color. Let's also change the opacities. So we're going to say set layer opacity. For this, simple tint node dot opacity equals 2. Now the opacity needs to be again between 0 and 1. So 0 is, well, 0, 1 is 100%. For that, we'll be saying the following. 100 minus I times 10, right? So remember, we also used this thing right here, and this will give us 100, 90, 80, and so on. And then we just divide that by 100. And finally, let's add the generated nodes to the parent frame. Remember the parent frame that we generated initially? It's this one right here. Well, now we can say parent frame dot append child tint node. And because we're still inside the for loop, on each iteration, this new circle that we created with the new name and the new opacity will be appended to the parent frame. Cool. So now let's generate. Let's give this a nice, let's say green color for now. Let's call this secondary just for the kicks. 10 tints. Let's make the circle size to 40, circle spacing 64, and make it vertical. Generate. And here it is in all of its glory. So we have one frame with 64 distance between items. That's this spacing right here. 64 pixels padding, we hard-coded that. We have 10 elements, 10 tints basically. So we're starting with the first color. This is the base, secondary 100, and then we go 90, 80, 70, 60. And then you can see that each one has the correct name, it has the correct opacity, and it goes all the way down to the number 10 here. Finally, just for some finishing touches, we can actually select that frame after we make it, and we can scroll and zoom it into view. That's really easy to make. I actually took some inspiration for that from the original demo that was here for the second plugin. And here we're going to say the following: select and zoom to the generated frame. So we're going to define a constant, select frame, and we actually need to do this. We're going to define this as frame node, and we're going to initialize it with an empty array. And select frame, we're going to say push parent frame. And then we can say Figma dot current page dot selection. That's going to be equal to that select frame. We did this because we cannot set Figma.currentPage.selection to the actual parent frame. We needed to create a frame node array in the form of this one, and then populate it with our parent frame, and then set that as the selection. It's just the way things work in Figma. And then we can say Figma.viewport.scroll and zoom into view. Oops, that select frame. And that's it. Let's do one final test. Let's only change the color here. Generate tints. And now the tints are generated properly. The frame is automatically selected for us, and it's zoomed into view, which is perfect. And finally, as a final touch, one of the questions you might have after watching this course is, Adi, can I style the UI of this plugin? Well, of course, you can style it, absolutely. You just go to UI HTML, you create a style script, and you can write whatever CSS you want in this area for any of the elements that you set up in your markup. So any CSS that you might write for a regular website, you can write here. For example, maybe I want the labels to be displayed above the inputs, right? So let's just close this for now. And I can say label display block. All right, so now if we run the plugin again, you'll see that these are now displayed above. Maybe I want to change the text color. Let's do something like this. Save. Let's run the plugin again. And now all the text will be a different color. You can do all sorts of things. Anything that you would do in CSS on a regular website, you can do here. You can target classes, IDs. You can probably use animations. I haven't actually tested that. It's really, really simple. All you have to do is write a style tag in here in the HTML file of your plugin and write your CSS there. Currently, Figma plugins do not support any kind of preprocessor. So if you're thinking about using Sass or less, as far as I know, you can't do that right now, nor can you write the CSS in an external file. It needs to be written in the UI.html. And there you have it, folks. One functional Figma plugin with a UI created in less than 1 hour. I hope this gave you a better understanding of how plugins work and how they can be created. As I was saying previously, the Figma documentation is your best friend. You can find everything nicely explained and organized there. So if you're ever stuck, go ahead and do a search on the documentation. You can also write CSS for your plugin. As I was saying previously, I didn't do it for this particular one because it already was way longer than I expected, and I didn't think it was essential. In the end, CSS is not really that important to creating a Figma plugin. It's just for eye candy, really. It's just to make your plugin look better. The important part was, the HTML, how the plugin is being displayed in the Figma UI, and also the code, the TypeScript code behind it, how it works, how it can send or receive messages from the UI and act upon the contents of those messages. So with that said, I hope you found this course useful. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Adi, and until next time, take care.